international development, teaching international development through an interdisciplinary case study. Rachel, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Ellie. So I'm really glad that my presentation was this afternoon after this morning's discussion around the use of simulations, role-playing, and case studies I would include in that. This was a project that I developed over 10 years ago when I was a new assistant professor at Beloit College, which is a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. For those not in the US, liberal arts colleges are undergraduate only institutions. And my colleagues and I were tasked with teaching development-based courses, but we're coming out of our own disciplinary training. I'm a political scientist. My research expertise is on rule of law development and comparative judicial politics in sub-Saharan Africa. And disciplinary teaching does remain the norm, particularly at undergraduate institutions. Primarily due to cost, institutional constraints, etc. And so my colleagues in economics, anthropology, and myself came up with a practical solution to linking courses. In an ideal world, I think we would team teach, but that ideal world doesn't exist. So we developed this joint case study or joint unit that we were able to place in our courses at the end of the semester, and that we hoped would encourage students to use practical problem solving skills, develop their policy analysis skills, and really think about skill development rather than kind of pushing content or pushing knowledge. And our hope here was not just that students would understand and recognize their disciplinary training or backgrounds, but they would start to begin to scaffold and bridge those disciplinary boundaries. So I say bridge rather than transcend deliberately, because it was about connecting as much as anything. So the institutional constraints on interdisciplinary teaching are probably obvious to pretty much everybody on this call. This unit allowed us to maneuver around these constraints in an effective way. So my course was Global Politics of Development. My colleague was Economic Development. And then my colleague in anthropology, she was a cultural anthropologist, used her senior seminar to work on this project with us. So each of the courses, we did our own thing. We didn't coordinate course content or preparation for this unit beyond just the unit itself. And that's interesting later on when I talk about the outcomes. We coordinated only to the extent that we timed it at the same time. So we decided to come up with a fictional case study based on a real-life community-based project from Botswana. So this was a RHINO sanctuary project. And so it was, in terms of topics, looking at tourism and development from the perspectives of these three social science disciplines: economics, political science, and anthropology. And by choosing to write a fictional case study, I think this gave us a lot more control in terms of writing up the case study with the specific three backgrounds: the economics, politics, and cultural or anthropological background. So the economics background focused on economic activities, distribution of productive assets, income, poverty, inequality. The political science background focused on the governance structure in the village, the role of chiefs, kotlas in decision-making and planning. And then finally, the anthropological section focused on kinship networks, gender relations, and the impact of labor outmigration from rural to urban areas. So this was a case study. We weren't asking students to take on roles. Instead, we were framing it as a group of interdisciplinary consultants who were tasked with formulating a set of policy recommendations. And we very simply asked them to argue, should the RHINO sanctuary be built or not? And if it was or it wasn't, either way, we wanted to see an implementation plan as well as a kind of a yes/no answer. In addition, We took a subgroup of students who we actually shared. We're a smaller college. We shared these students, and they'd taken classes with more than one of us. And we tasked them with being the assessment team. So they was assess the work of their peers. And their project then was to create an assessment rubric and to defend that rubric, and then obviously to apply it. Ultimately, myself and my colleagues were responsible for assigning the grades, but the student assessment group moved between the three classes and assessed the work of the other students. So very quickly, some of the logistics. The instructors rotated amongst one another's classes. As I mentioned before, we graded our own students' work. We each dedicated about 3 class periods to working groups, but the majority of the writing itself and the reports came about through outside group meetings. So, assessment of learning outcomes. So our first-hand observations of the group work in class, we did see, for the most part, a shift away from kind of compartmentalizing tasks amongst the various students in their areas of expertise towards integration of scaffolding between the different disciplinary perspectives. It was clear that the students were enjoying the small group work and that they understood the series of trade-offs at stake, you know, the kind of things that you all have been talking about the last day or so with your various case studies and simulations. And so as we graded the proposals, we were looking for evidence of compromise and also an articulation of the possible consequences of their decisions, both intended and unintended. However, there's no doubt that certain students and groups did struggle with this jumping back and forth between the disciplines and resolving the tensions or the competing goals of the project. And I don't necessarily see that struggle as a bad thing, but certainly it came through strongly in student evaluations. And finally, it was interesting that maybe not surprising, the anthropology students, many of them ultimately just rejected the project and really kind of embraced the more critical post-development literature that they had been reading in their class. We did do some surveys. So this is surveys from 2 iterations of this project, and we feel confident that the students did walk away with an increased appreciation for interdisciplinary thinking. I think students, and this speaks again broader conversations we've been having the last 2 days, struggled a little bit with lack of specific knowledge around this topic. And by this topic, I mean this community development project really was grounded in conflict around land and land tenure, and that's a very specialized subject that they weren't trained in. So the kind of limitations of these kind of scenario case-based teaching when students don't have the time or they haven't received as much training as they'd like in the subject. These are just some responses from qualitative responses that we received. And again, I think the importance of looking at a problem from various perspectives, in this case, the 3 disciplines, was pretty universally responded to favorably by the students. So I've gone really fast through the mechanics of this, but I did want to create space at the end. I have a final slide here, and maybe we want to revisit this conversation this morning, maybe we don't, maybe we're done with it. But I asked myself, I mean, I was really grateful for this workshop to, because I'm now 10 years out from developing this. I asked myself, does this mode of teaching still fit within a decolonizing approach to development? And I think I have a number of thoughts and reflections on this. First, I'll say yes, and that the initial learning, or the big learning goal here, was to move students away from kind of grand paradigmatic theories of development and to understand the importance of cross-disciplinary fertilization and connections, not just differences in learning or understanding development. I think that I too struggle more today than I did 10 years ago with potential problematic portrayals of groups. So in this case, there wasn't role play simulation, but we developed a different version of, or different case study on land reform in Vietnam, in which we did do role playing. I have experience firsthand. I don't have time to go into it. I have experience firsthand, and I do struggle a little bit with those problematic or stereotypical portrayals of different groups and stakeholders. But there's no doubt, as several people have already mentioned, that this type of learning does result in higher engagement with both the politics on the ground and certainly the emotions of these projects. I think one of the takeaways from my own work, and also from listening to people talking this morning, is, the importance of in-depth research for the students and adequate time for debriefing and reflection. And that becomes tricky, right, when you're coordinating across 3 courses. I've also been reflecting on the suitability at undergraduate versus graduate level courses. I think there's pros and cons at the undergraduate kind of general preparation level versus more specific graduate type settings. My course readings, since we've experimented with this case study, I think I've moved towards a more critical approach to development, as many people in this workshop have discussed. And so, what does that mean in terms of struggling with or engaging with these real world case studies? And then finally, it's been striking to me, both revisiting this project, my own project, and listening to other people, just how extraordinary the startup costs are for developing your own materials and writing your own materials. And it strikes me that there is an opportunity here to potentially publish these pedagogical materials, potentially on an electronic platform that can be updated. So the startup costs are not so high and can be shared amongst in other settings by the faculty. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
We have a few minutes before we transition to our next session. So maybe, does anyone have any other responses to the question that Rachel posed about whether this sort of approach is a decolonizing or decolonial approach to teaching development studies?
I think it's complicated, right? A lot of contextual factors going on.
It's been interdisciplinarity is sort of a marketing strategy for, department or maybe college. Students are trained interdisciplinary so that they can deal with the real world problem. And I don't know how. I mean, is it marketing just marketing strategy, or that can be decolonizing? I don't know. That's I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think that's right. Marketing, and we've talked a lot about buzzwords, and to what extent is it marketing or recruiting students, or however you want to phrase that, versus meaningfully getting students to think about and engage with these real world or real scenario issues. Jean, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think the question, to respond to the question, we have to look at how we interact. Because you could do a case study and interact in a very colonial manner, just as we do in development work a lot of times, in a very colonial manner. So it seems that I was going to ask, did you have like a certain reflections as well as like, well, you must have, because you had post-development approaches or whatever, and so I would imagine that would generate a certain discussion on colonial issues as well. And so, but it seems it has a lot to do with how we interact with the communities, and it's not just the communities.
Yeah, absolutely. How we interact. And, one thing I was thinking about as I prepared this presentation was, you know, I think one version of this could be to get students to think about how they would collect information or how they would talk to different communities. So the kind of how in the process, rather than just allowing them to skip to this position of authority or voice on what they think should happen. So paying more attention to the steps in between or the process. Okay, that's it. Oh, Phyllis had a hand up. I don't know, Phyllis, if you have like a quick or...
Yeah, quick question. Quite a few presentations in this workshop use created case studies, self-created case study, simulated case study, versus using real-world program reports, which I use a lot, as opposed to just kind of created some composite case study. What do you think the learning outcomes, the different learning outcomes would be using one type of case study versus another?
Yeah, that's a great point. I do use real world case studies as well, but I also often find that those are still a synthetic product, right? In the sense that somebody's written them up. For a while, I was using the Kennedy School case studies, and they've historically had a strong kind of neoliberal bent, and that's okay, right? If you talk about it and you acknowledge that. I think fictional simulations and fictional case studies, the benefits are that you can certainly manipulate it to the goals, your learning goals and outcomes in your course. And maybe kind of disengage from I don't know, problematic emotions or identifications or politics in a way that is potentially helpful. So that's a big question, and I think that there are definitely pros and cons to fictional versus real world. Yeah.